All right, we're looking at Daniel 8 this hour. If you want to turn there in your Bibles, why is the two big kings so all-fired important? And we'll try to address that. This is, I think, a little tougher passage than Daniel 7. I can tell by the numbers that we drove a few people away. But thankful for you, durable remnant that turned up. So we'll look at Daniel chapter 8. Let's read it and get it in front of us again. We're still in these visions. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the capital, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal. I raised my eyes and saw, behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I'd seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the hosts and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the hosts. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and hosts to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. Behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end." And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, "Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face who understands riddles shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. Then he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great.
Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. I should say that some aspects of this was just in a survey of this sort, we won't be able to pick apart, and there are disputed things. What does because of transgression mean? For instance, in verse 12, there are various matters that we would normally need to clear up in a detailed exposition, and we can't do all that, so we just have to try to give a sort of a survey treatment of this. Now, there was a time when Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator pre and during World War II and so on, well, I guess he had gastronomical problems. His wife could find him at some point clutching his stomach and rolling in pain and agony on the floor. This happened, I think, during part of when the Italian forces were experiencing some reverses in the African campaign, and some medical specialists were called in, of course, to treat Mussolini, the Duce, and so on. One of them was of a kind of a cynical bent, though probably a truthful one. He was called in to help treat Mussolini, and his assessment of Mussolini was he's just a failed journalist with ulcers. He's really not all that important. He really doesn't cut that much mustard. And he could cause misery and create mayhem, but actually he was not of that much account. And in this piece of predictive prophecy in Daniel 8, Daniel passes on revelation about a relatively obscure king, historically speaking, who will rise from a split-off of the Greek Empire and cause havoc for Israel. But why bother to spill a chapter's ink on someone apparently that historically insignificant? So we'll try to attack that in process. Now, as you look at the chapter, this doesn't solve near all your problems. But when you have a perplexing chapter like this, you want to try to break it up in its parts so you can follow it. And you notice you have the setting in verses 1 and 2. Then you have the contents of the vision in verses 3 to 14. So setting, 1 and 2, contents, 3 to 14. Then the interpretation of the vision in 15 to 26. So setting, context, interpretation, 15 to 26. And then the impact of the vision in verse 27. Impact, verse 27. So that doesn't solve your problems. It just helps you kind of have a way to focus on the various parts. And that's useful, I think. Now, why bother with what's being told us in Daniel chapter 8? And this, in some ways, is more difficult, I think, to explain maybe than Daniel 7. Here's the point. It's important for God's people to know and prepare for what they will have to face. That's the thrust of Daniel 8. It's important for God's people to know and prepare for what they have or what they will have to face. Now, I'm going to divide this up into two segments. And let's go, first of all, I think the one matter that Daniel 8 is teaching us is that God steadies his people to walk through the course of history. That's the first point. And I told you already, there are two, so that gives you hope. Now, this comes from verses 1 to 8 and verses 20 to 23. Verses 20 to 23 are part of the interpretation that relate to verses 1 to 8. So that's what we'll be looking at, and I'll be drawing on both of those. God steadies his people to walk through the course of history. Now, as you look there at verse 1, you notice this vision comes to Daniel in the 3rd year of Belshazzar. That's 550 BC. Belshazzar, he's still in Babylon. Babylon is still a cohesive empire. And that's the historical setting. In verse 2, though, Daniel sees himself in the vision, and he was in Susa. That's in the province of Elam, and Susa will be a center of Persian power when the Persians come to power later. Susa was 220 miles east of Babylon, 150 miles north of the Persian Gulf. So when he sees himself in Susa, he is a long ways away. He's actually in Babylon. It was in the 3rd year of Belshazzar when the vision appeared to him. But in the vision, Daniel sees himself in what will be a center of Persian dominance later. If you think of 550 BC, the 3rd year of Belshazzar, you realize that the Babylonian Empire then will last about 10 or 11 more years, after which Israel will be permitted, when the Persians take power, to go back to the land of Judah. So, setting is actually in Babylon, but in the vision, Daniel sees himself in Susa, and so on. Now, let's look at the first part of this vision and what it depicts and what it implies. Seems to me it depicts, for one thing, rerun of chapter 7, it depicts a turbulent time of history. Look at verses 3 through 8. I'm not going to read through all of it, but there's a ram, right, on the bank of the canal, and so on. Had 2 horns. Both horns were high. One was higher than the other. And in the glossary, in verses 20 to 23, the ram represents the kings of Media and Persia. Persia became the dominant one of those 2 components. And, of course, it's dominating the then-known world. No one, verse 4, could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. Okay, so that's Persia. And then there's the Greek goat that comes in verse 5. The male goat, and that's interpreted in verse 21. That's the king of Greece. And it conquers, and indeed it just almost obliterates the ram. So Greece conquers Persia and so on, talks about the rage of the goat and so on in verse 7. Cast him down to the ground, trampled on him. There was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Okay, so the goat became exceedingly great and so on. And then after the Greek, the goat comes to power, then the prominent horn, which is probably a reference to Alexander the Great, is broken, and there are 4 conspicuous horns that come out of that kingdom. So the kingdom splits up, last of verse 8. So there you have a turbulent time of history. This is where things are fragile, things can be furious in this pattern of nations and empires rising and falling. And I think the point is, this is where the people of God have to live. This is where Israel is living in this, will be living in this kind of stuff. History is a turbulent locale, and history is even a part of your address. It's a turbulent history that's depicted here. Now, I think it's also a humbling history that's depicted in verses 3 to 8. The vision tells us that superpowers get knocked off or suddenly peter out. Well, you look at that ram representing Medo-Persia in verses 2 and 3, and it just looked like it's unbeatable. It's so dominant and so on. And yet then you get this male goat that has a real temper tantrum and just comes at him and has no mercy and so on. So one superpower is knocked off by an ascending superpower, etc. They can be quickly overthrown and knocked off. But then there's something else. Sometimes a superpower just peters out. They just kind of drift off the scene. You notice how it depicts in verse 8, the great horn. Now that's the Greek male goat, and it had a great horn before it's broken up into the 4 kingdoms that flow from it. And that great horn is likely a reference to that would be Alexander the Great would be fulfilling that element of the prophecy. The great horn, notice how it puts it in verse 8, when he was strong, the great horn was broken. At the apex of his strength and power and achievement, he's broken. Just like that. Sometimes that happens too. Will Durant talks about Alexander the Great. Time came, when he was wanted to be a deity. He wanted to be known as the son of Zeus Ammon. So that created a bit of a stir, I think, among people. But that's what he wanted, and as time went on, Alexander had enjoyed so many conquests, he became kind of Persified, actually, and he was in Babylon, actually, when he died. He was giving himself more and more to drink, and there was a contest, a drinking contest, that they held, and one of Alexander's lackeys actually downed 12 quarts of wine, and he won the prize. He also died 3 days later. Alexander, though, at a banquet not long after that, drowned a container of 6 quarts of wine. And then he drank heavily the next night following that. Cold weather set in. Alexander contracted a fever. He held on for 10 or 11 days, and then he died in the 33rd year of his age. And his empire almost evaporated into splinters and so on. Sometimes that can happen. Sometimes you can be at the apex of your power. It looks like everything, all systems are go. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken. So one way or another. The point being, superpowers like Persia and Greece at the time, as they will come, superpowers are very fragile. And God has a way of periodically breaking them. It may be from another attack. It may be from just cutting their power. The country in which we live is called a superpower, isn't it? Did I say just a minute ago, superpowers are very fragile? And God has a way of periodically breaking them. Now, so this history that's depicted is a turbulent history, it's a humbling history, and therefore this history requires a sober and durable discipleship from God's people. Now remember, Daniel's in Babylon, but the 70 years exile of Israel is kind of coming close to an end. It's 550 BC according to verse 1, and in about 10 or 11 years, Israel will be permitted by Cyrus the Persian to return to the land of Judah. And And so that time in Babylon is coming closer to a close. And here you have this vision of Persia, the dominance of Persia, and then the dominance of Greece, and then the split up kingdoms that come off of the kingdom of Greece, etc., when it hits its part of its demise, and so on. This has, I think, importance for the people of Israel that the book of Daniel is trying to, and the book of Daniel is trying to instruct them about this. Let me come at it this way. You notice that in the vision here in chapter 8, it seems to see a time in the future when Israel is back in the land. They're not in Babylon, but those who wanted to return have returned to the land. You notice in verse 9 it refers to the glorious land. That's the land of Israel. And then you notice in verses 12 and 13 that it seems to, the text seems to assume that there is a time that Israel is not only back in the land, but the temple worship has been reestablished and is functioning. Because this king that arises later stops it and brings it to an end. But it assumes that in the meantime that Israel has been back in the land and there is the functioning of the temple worship. So it foresees that coming down the road. I think one of the points being made here for Israel, pretend you're an Israelite in Babylon, and you may be expecting, hopefully, that the exile will soon be over and you can get back to the land. It seems that one of the purposes of the book of Daniel is to say to such people, to say to Israel, now don't think that when you get back in the land, the kingdom is going to come on earth. Don't think that when you get back to the land, the Messiah is going to appear. Now, you can get that in Daniel chapter 2. You remember you had those four empires, sort of, the gold, the silver, and so on. The four empires. What was that meant to say in part? Wasn't that meant to say to Israel, you know, before the kingdom of God comes in its fullness, you need to realize there's a whole raft of Gentile nations and empires that are going to be in place. The kingdom of God is not going to come immediately. You've got a whole course of history to go through, and so on. I think the same thing from Daniel chapter 7, which we saw earlier this morning. Hopefully you've got the four beasts and so on. There's a pattern, there's a process, there's a sequence of history, and there are Gentile pagan nations, and that's the same here in chapter 8 now. Gentile pagan nations, in this case, Persia, and then Greece, and the split-offs from Greece. That's going to take some time. You may be back in the land at the end of the exile, but that's not necessarily going to mean that the kingdom of God is coming. You still have to live. You're going to be living under Gentile regimes, pagan regimes. And you're going to have to exercise your faithfulness and your faith and your discipleship under that kind of context. It's sort of saying, if we can just cut it down to the basic, this is going to be a long haul, not a quick fix. You're going to have to plod along in faithfulness under non-ideal conditions because the kingdom is not coming yet, even when you return to the land. And I think the book of Daniel, in part, is meant to underscore that for Israel. And so, by telling and by depicting this, for instance, here in chapter 8, it's as if the Lord wants to prepare His people to endure a course of history and maintain faithfulness through a course of history when there aren't any miraculous interventions. and the coming of the kingdom yet. We can have a problem with false expectations. That's why I think it's so good that God made the point clear to Israel here. William Shearer, in his book, I think it's called The Berlin Diary, he was you maybe remember him more for his classic The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. But he wrote this collection called The Berlin Diary, and he was, I think that's what it was, correspondent in Berlin in the early days, maybe from 1934 to 1940, not during the thick of World War II, but leading up to that time. And he was still there in 1940. And there was, I don't know the exact date in 1940, but it was the time when the British came over and did their first bombing run on Berlin. Now, Shearer said, if you went out the next day and you looked at the faces of the Berliners, they were stunned. You could tell it in their demeanor and in the look on their face. Why were they stunned? They were stunned because Hermann Goering had assured them that Berlin would never be bombed. And the British came over and bombed it. Now, they didn't do any material damage, hardly at all. I don't even know if anyone was killed in that barrage and in that attack. But the British had bombed Berlin, and they hadn't been prepared for it. They were told it would never happen, and they had false expectations. And it can be disastrous for the people of God if we have false expectations. But you see, we have a God who is kind and gracious. The God who warns Israel that it's going to be a long haul here. You're going to have to go on being faithful in sometimes dark times. But he doesn't give them any false hope. That's how God steadies his people to walk through the course of history. And in one sense, that's the same call that we have. You remember Jesus in Luke 19:11. It was right after the Zacchaeus episode, and he was going to Jerusalem. And he told them a parable, it says, because he was near Jerusalem, and they thought that the kingdom of God would immediately appear. So he tells them a parable, doesn't he? And he tells them about a certain nobleman that goes into a far country to receive the kingship for his land. That's going to take some time. And in the meantime, he gives certain finances out to certain servants in order that they can work with that and develop it and earn more resources and so on. But the point is, the kingdom isn't coming immediately when we go up to Jerusalem. It's going to be a long time. It's going to be an extended time. And that was what Jesus was doing there. So our God is kind. He won't have us face false expectations. So he steadies his people to walk through the course of history. Now, the second point, God forearms his people to face the crises of history. This is from verses 9 to 19 and verses 23 to 26. God forearms his people to face the crises of history. Okay, let's look at the climax of the vision in verses 9 to 14. Now, you're going to say, why didn't he touch on that? Why didn't he touch on that? We can't touch on everything. But we'll try to get the high points here. In the climax of the vision, you notice in verse 9, out of one of these four fragment kingdoms from the Greek kingdom, verse 9, out of one of them came a little horn. Literally, one horn from littleness, it says. But it translates a little horn. And then notice the power of this little horn, probably referring to a king, obviously, but it grew exceedingly great. Notice the four uses of great. Grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the hosts and some of the stars it threw down to the ground, trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. That's a reference probably to God himself, and so on. Now, so his power, great, 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 in opposition to God and his worship. Verses 11 and 13. What happened? Well, the regular burnt offering was taken away from him. From whom? I assume the prince of the host, or from God. The temple worship, the regular burnt offering, was taken away. This is looking ahead to the time when Israel's back in the land. And the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. So there wasn't any sacrificial worship. This king made orthodox, proper biblical worship cease. Stopped it. So that tells you something about this king. And then you notice the dominance over people in verse 12 and his success. And then notice the duration of this attack on Yahweh's worship and on really the people of God. It says in verses 13 and 14, one Holy One says to another, "How long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? How long is this enforced prevention of true worship going to take place? How long will it be? 2,300 evenings and mornings," verse 14. Now what's that mean? Well, it depends whom you read. And sometimes I read one person and sometimes I read the other, and they can convince you and you waffle back and forth. But there are mainly two views here. Some say, well, 2,300 evenings and mornings. And evenings and mornings, that means that would be a day. So that means they take it as being half the total, 1,150. That would be a little over 3 years, if that's what's meant. Others would say, no, the 2,300 evenings and mornings is referring to 2,300 days. In that case, it would be 6+ years. You don't need to decide that today, and neither do I. There are ways in which it works, either position you take. But notice then it mentions in verses 17 and 19 the end. And this is a little tricky. And watch me here, I may not satisfy you. But in verse 17, Daniel's going to have the vision explained. And the angel says, verse 17, "Understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end." Now what does the end mean? Well, you look at verse 19. "I will make known to you what shall be the latter end of the indignation," where it refers to the appointed time of the end. My take on that is that it's not speaking of the absolute end, right before the kingdom comes, but it's speaking of the time of the end and the appointed time of the end when the worship of verse 13 will be restored. That is the end of the time when this king's imposition and prohibition of true worship, when the end of that comes, and the worship can be restored again. So it's not an absolute end, it's the end of the ravages that this king will impose on Israel. Now, when this king and the suffering he inflicts will be wiped off the plate of history. Now, what's the name of this scourge? We've been talking about this king, this so-called little horn here. It's really depicting, most likely, the career and the program of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, who's that? And it's easy to spell it, right? Just the word Antioch, and then put US on the end, and then you have Antiochus. It's actually called historically Antiochus IV, but Antiochus IV, I think on his coins, would put himself forth as Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus God manifest. Of course, there were some who referred to him as Antiochus Epiphanes. That sort of means Antiochus the nutcase. So, not everybody swallowed his claims. He seemed to be a very talented and resourceful ruler in a way, but very unstable, and so on. But it's this Antiochus Epiphanes, and he reigned from about, for our purposes, from about 170 to 164 BC. If you want some historical backdrop on it, you probably are familiar with the Apocrypha. That is, those books that do not belong to the canon of Scripture, but are part of Jewish heritage and so on. Sometimes you have them in an English translation between the Old and New Testaments in certain editions of the Bible. But if you get a hold of the Apocrypha, you can read 1 Maccabees chapter 1, 2 Maccabees chapter 6. It'll give you more background on what this Antiochus Epiphanes did in those days near the end of the Old Testament period, and how he afflicted Israel and so on. Now, I'm trying to summarize in a brief scope. Antiochus Epiphanes, he was the four kingdoms that split off from Greece. Antiochus Epiphanes was from the one you would call the Syrian one, and they were called the Seleucids. And Antiochus Epiphanes was having conflicts with Egypt, and he would go down there on campaigns and so on. And in 167 BC, he had gone into Egypt. He had been rebuffed by, in that case, the Romans told him to get out of there. And he was in a foul mood, among other things, when he came back through Jerusalem. There were some disturbances in Jerusalem and so on. And Antiochus decided that he was going to Hellenize, that is, make into Greek, make Greek culture dominant. He was going to Hellenize the people of Judah, the Jewish people. And he was going to impose that with a vengeance. Now, previously, he had already demanded in taxes 1/3 of their grain and 1/2 of their fruit crops. That's just by way, give you a flavor for what the kind of thing he was doing. But now his design is to systematically, totally, irreversibly wipe out biblical faith from the face of the earth. Okay? That's what he's after. You can get a taste of it. I think in a summary, let me quote basically Will Durant here in kind of a combination of the kinds of things he did. So this is Antiochus Epiphanes, about 167 to 164 in Judah. So here's what happened. He marched up to Jerusalem, slaughtered Jews of either sex by the thousand, desecrated and looted the temple. You see, he was always fighting wars and going on campaigns, so he always had to have money. So you would rob temples in order to supply resources for that. He appropriated for the royal coffers its golden altar, its vessels, and its treasuries. He gave orders for the compulsory Hellenization of all Jews. He commanded that the temple be rededicated as a shrine to Zeus, that a Greek altar be built over the old altar of burnt offering,
and that the usual sacrifices be replaced with a sacrifice of swine. Swine are unclean for Jewish people, you know. So he imposed that. He forbade the keeping of the Sabbath or the Jewish festivals and made circumcision a capital crime. There was one case where a couple of women, mothers, had circumcised their infant sons. And those infant sons were tied to the breast of those mothers, and all of them were thrown over the wall to their deaths. That's the sort of thing he had done. Every Jew who refused to eat pork, or who was found possessing the book of the law — you can't have any of the scriptures, you see — who was found possessing the book of the law was to be jailed or killed, and the book, wherever found, was to be burned. Jerusalem itself was put to the flames, its walls were destroyed, and its Jewish population was sold into slavery. The orgy of persecution became intensified as it proceeded. The agents of Antiochus, having put an end to all visible expression of Judaism in Jerusalem, passed like a searching fire into the towns and villages. Everywhere they gave people a choice between death and participation in Hellenic worship, which included the eating of sacrificial swine. That was Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, you could have to carry it over, but he's taking away all the means of grace, all the right matters of worship, and so on. And he's trying to eradicate and wipe out biblical faith from the face of the earth for a total of 6+ years. Now, what's the important? That's the climax of the vision, and the focus is on this Antiochus Epiphanes king and what he does. Now, what's the importance of this prediction? Notice that there's an assumption in verse 26, or I think there is. Daniel was told the vision of the evenings and mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. Now, I don't think sealing up the vision meant that it was never to be exposed or revealed and so on. But you notice it says it pertains to many days from now. I think the assumption of verse 26 is time will come when you'll need this. Even though it's sealed now, though it's way down the timeline, the time will come when you will have need of this revelation, etc. Now, why this prediction? If Daniel, as I would hold, if Daniel's revelation here is coming about 550 BC in Babylon, why make a prediction about some minor king that won't arise for 380 years later? Now, Daniel doesn't know that it's 380 years. We know that because we look back to it. But why focus on a kind of a relatively minor king 380 years from now? So there are critics who say that it's really incomprehensible that Daniel would predict the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes 380 years beforehand. They don't really, sometimes they will say, well, not that he couldn't have predicted, but that he wouldn't. Why would he want to make some prediction? They really don't think he could. But why would he do that? Such a minor king. That just seems a little bit ridiculous. So why would he zero in on such a minor figure? Well, that's the point. Was he really minor? A number of years ago, let's see, probably, I don't know, late 1800s, there was and early 1900s, there was an Old Testament scholar at Princeton by the name of Robert Dick Wilson.
he made a very good point about this prediction about Antiochus Epiphanes and about the scourge that Antiochus would inflict on Israel. It was this. His point is that the church, God's people, had never faced a peril like the peril under Antiochus Epiphanes. This, he says, was the deadliest this was the deadliest peril that the church had ever confronted. More so than the genocide under Esther by Haman, the attempted genocide. No. This dealt with their faith. This wasn't just with their existence, but this dealt with their faith and their religion and the covenant. And here is a man who is seeking to exterminate completely, irreversibly, not only the people of God, but their very faith from the earth. They have never faced anything like that in their history. And because of that extreme peril, it merited unusual prediction. Is he not going to warn his people of that great a danger? That's the point Robert Dick Wilson is making. And therefore, the necessity for the Lord to warn his people of their greatest danger to date. And the kindness of the Lord in doing that. And giving them a revelation through Daniel that can be picked up in many days from now. And they can be warned of what they're going to be facing. Yes, it's the extremity of the danger that validates the necessity of the prediction ahead of time. Now, this is a similar point with what we were doing in the first segment, isn't it, about this whole matter of expectation and so on. I remember, we retired once, and we settled in Cookeville, Tennessee, and enjoyed our home there. And it was in that home that I remember one evening, I think it was, that I was walking down the hallway, out of the kitchen and down the hallway past the guest bedroom, and nonchalantly minding my own business, and all of a sudden I heard, boom! It was my wife who had hidden in the guest bedroom and scared the living daylights out of you. You know, you were not expecting something, and all of a sudden you get this boom, and so on. You're not expecting it, it just shatters you. You know, you would think that some woman that had, was in her 60s, etc., and had endured the privations of a long marital relationship would be more calm and sedate, less creative. But no, boom! And you just jump out of your skin because you weren't waiting for it. But sometimes you think of those things, you think, sometimes someone, if they're prone to play tricks like that, and if you happen to see them sneak into that room, they don't know. See? Well, then it's a different picture, isn't it? Then you have two choices. Then you can walk down the hallway knowing what's there, and when she says, boo, you don't flinch. You just keep on going, and that derives her a pleasure. Or you have another option. You can go walking down the hallway, and as you just approach that door where you know she's lurking, You jump out of it, boom! And it scares her. And that gives you pleasure and derives her pleasure. But you have to know, it helps to know these things. You don't want to get caught blindsided. Now that's the point here though. This is the kindness that is extended to the people of God. The Lord God tells His people what's coming. And He does the same for us. Though we're much later, aren't we, than Daniel's Israel, and much later in the timeline. This is a little tricky. You notice that there are two little horns, at least in your English version, two little horns in the book of Daniel. In chapter 7, verse 8, we read of that one that comes out of the fourth beast, the different kingdom, before the judgment of the Ancient of Days. And here in chapter 8, verse 9, is another little horn, but notice it comes out of the kingdom of Greece, not out of the fourth kingdom. In other words, the little horn of chapter 7 and the little horn of chapter 8 are not the same. The one in chapter 7 comes out of that fourth, different, final kingdom. But the one in chapter 8 and verse 9 comes out of the goat kingdom, the split up of the Greek kingdom, and so on. So they're different entities. They're not the same. But they act similarly, don't they? They both seek to crush and afflict the people of God. They both attack the Lord's people. They're both hostile to Christ's church, you might say. So they act the same way. And what's that tell us? Well, that sort of tells us, in our place in history, that perhaps we can see in Antiochus Epiphanes, in the little horn of chapter 8, we can see a kind of a preview, a kind of a preliminary sketch, a kind of a foreshadowing of that final little horn in chapter 7. Of the kinds of things we may have to face. What you can say is that Antiochus Epiphanes, the little horn of chapter 8, is a kind of an antichrist before the Antichrist. He's a preview of what that one might be like. He's a foreshadow. And we have to say, isn't God kind? There's a snapshot of the sort of thing you may have to face at various times in your discipleship. And that's why a two-bit king is so all-fired important. He's a sketch. He's a foreshadow of what is yet to come. And God forearms you for it. Now, Pastor Evan is dealing in John chapter 15. And last night he was speaking about the hatred of the world that Jesus spoke about and how they hated him and that hate his disciples and the world hates you. And that's that whole pile of instruction in the last of John 15. And then what does Jesus say in John 16 verse 1? In view of all that in chapter 15, he says, I have said all these things to you to keep you from falling away. There's a reason for this. I forearmed you to face the crises of history. Now, may Yahweh, maker of heaven and earth, keeper of Israel, and your keeper, keep you from despair and from exhaustion, and keep you faithful in temptation and trial, until the day when the Son of Man who has received the kingdom will come again. Amen. You're dismissed.
Well.
Wednesday?
Thursday.